The year is 1878, and in Whispering Pine Valley, a man's past is about to catch up with him. A single rifle shot splits the evening air, a sound that would soon become all too familiar in this peaceful farming community. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across Matthew Reed's wheat fields, where the 45-year-old farmer moves with practiced efficiency through his evening chores. His calloused hands tell the story of 3 years of honest farm work, but the faint scars across his knuckles hint at a different life, one he'd left behind in Wyoming Territory. The distant howl of a coyote mingles with the gentle lowing of cattle as he makes his way through the barnyard, an old brass pocket watch keeping time with each measured step. The modest farmhouse sits nestled against the foothills, far enough from town to offer solitude, but close enough to hear the whistle of the new railway line that brought change, both good and bad, to Whispering Pine. Matthew had chosen this spot carefully, just as he'd once chosen ambush positions in his former life. But those days were supposed to be behind him, buried as deep as the worn leather gunbelt hidden beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. Before we dive deeper into this tale, tell us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories of justice and redemption, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've saved something special for you. The evening routine is interrupted by the distant sound of hooves, 3 riders approaching from the direction of town. Matthew's hand instinctively moves to his hip, where a colt peacemaker would have rested in his bounty hunting days. The gesture is automatic, muscle memory from tracking down the West's most dangerous outlaws. He catches himself, forcing his hand back to the pitchfork he's been using to spread fresh hay. The farmhouse, though modest, stands as a testament to Matthew's determination to build a new life. Its weathered boards and solid foundation mirror his own character, worn by time and elements, but unshakable. The barn, freshly painted a deep red, houses not only his livestock, but also memories of simpler times, when the only shots fired were at crop-stealing crows. 3 riders emerge from the evening haze, their horses kicking up dust as they approach the farmhouse. Leading them is Jack Snake Eyes Keller, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness has spread through the territory like wildfire. The silver spurs on his boots catch the fading light, matching the cold gleam in his eyes. Behind him, the Ryder brothers Tom and Frank fan out as they near the house. Tom, the elder, sports a fresh knife scar along his jaw, while Frank's youth barely masks his predatory nature. "Evening, Mr. Reed," Keller calls out, his voice carrying false warmth. "Fine day for a chat about property boundaries, wouldn't you say?" He tips his hat, a gesture that makes Matthew's skin crawl. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, paws at the ground impatiently, sharing its rider's restless malice. Matthew sets down his pitchfork with deliberate care, his movements slow and measured. Years of tracking outlaws taught him to read men like books, and these 3 are an open story of violence waiting to happen. "My boundaries are well marked, Keller," he responds, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "Same as they were when I bought this land fair and square." Keller's smile doesn't reach his eyes. But you see, Mr. Reed, things are changing in Whispering Pine. The railway's coming through and land values are rising. Mr. Hawthorne's taking a special interest in this valley. He's offering to buy up all the farms for a fair price." His hand rests casually on his holstered revolver, a Remington that's seen its share of dirty work. Matthew watches the exchange with calculated calm, noting how the Ryder brothers position themselves to cover both exits from the barn. He knows about James Iron Rail Hawthorne, everyone in the territory does, a man who built his empire on broken promises and buried bodies, using the coming railroad as leverage to force honest folks from their land. "This farm's not for sale," Matthew states firmly, each word carrying the weight of his resolve. "Never has been, never will be. I've put down roots here, Keller." The Ryder brothers exchange glances, their hands hovering near their weapons. but Keller raises a hand, maintaining his facade of civility. "No need for hasty decisions, Mr. Reed. We'll give you time to think it over. Say, until the next new moon." His smile widens, though the threat in his voice is clear as a mountain stream. Though I should mention, accidents tend to happen to folks who take too long to make up their minds. The evening sun seems to dim as Keller speaks, as if nature itself recoils from his threats. A hawk circles overhead, its cry piercing the tension like an arrow. As they turn to leave, Frank Ryder's eyes linger on the farmhouse, studying its vulnerabilities. "Shame if anything were to happen to your nice farm, old man," he calls out, earning a sharp look from Keller that does nothing to mask the menace in his words. Once the riders disappear into the growing dusk, Matthew moves swiftly to his bedroom. The floorboards creak as he lifts the loose plank, revealing a worn leather gun belt wrapped around a Colt Peacemaker. The weapon's pearl handle is smooth from years of use, its barrel oiled and maintained despite 3 years of hiding. Beside it lies a tin star, a U.S. Marshal's badge that marked him as one of the most successful bounty hunters in the Wyoming Territory. Matthew runs his fingers over the badge, remembering the weight it once carried, both physical and moral. He'd hung up his guns after the Bitter Creek incident, where bringing in the notorious Carson gang had cost 3 innocent lives. He'd vowed then to find a quieter path, one that didn't require him to choose between justice and mercy. But as he watches the sun set behind the mountains, Matthew knows that sometimes a man's past chooses him, no matter how far he tries to run from it. The coming days would test not just his skill with a gun, but his ability to protect the peace he'd built without becoming the man he'd left behind in Wyoming. As darkness settles over Whispering Pine Valley, Matthew Reed makes his way to a small shed behind the barn, one that casual observers might mistake for a simple storage space. The padlock's key hangs from a chain around his neck, its weight a constant reminder of the life he'd tried to leave behind. Inside, beneath burlap sacks and farming tools, lies a locked chest that hasn't seen daylight in 3 years. The lamp's flame flickers as Matthew opens the chest, revealing not just weapons and ammunition, but a carefully preserved collection of wanted posters, newspaper clippings, and a leather-bound journal. Each item tells a story of his 15 years as a bounty hunter, stories he'd hoped would remain buried in the past. "Thought you might come here tonight," a familiar voice speaks from the doorway. Samuel "Doc" Wilson steps into the lamplight, his silver hair gleaming. The town's physician is one of the few people who knows Matthew's true identity, having patched him up years ago after a particularly nasty encounter with the Carson gang. "Been a while since Snake Eyes Keller showed his face in civilized territory," Doc continues, settling onto a wooden crate. "Last I heard, he was running with Iron Rail Hawthorne's crew down in Colorado, left quite a trail of bereaved widows and burning homesteads." Matthew lifts a Winchester rifle from the chest, checking its action with practiced hands. "Hawthorne's using the railroad as cover," he says, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Buying up land cheap, or taking it by force when people won't sell. Had 3 families over in Cedar Ridge lose everything last month." Doc watches as Matthew examines each weapon in his arsenal, noting how the years of farming haven't dulled his friend's expertise. "Sheriff Thompson's good with a gun," he offers, "but he's got no experience dealing with men like Hawthorne and Keller. Most of his deputies are local boys who've never faced real killers." A bitter laugh escapes Matthew's throat. "Thompson's a good man, but he's in over his head. Hawthorne's got judges and territorial officials in his pocket. Law won't help us here." He pauses, running a hand over a wanted poster featuring a younger version of Keller. "7 years ago, I tracked him through the Bitter Creek Mountains. Had him dead to rights, but he escaped during that blizzard that killed half the posse. And now he's here," Doc muses. "Probably doesn't even know who you really are. The great ghost hunter of Wyoming, the man who brought in the Carson gang and the Blackwater boys, now living as a simple farmer. He leans forward, his voice dropping. But that's not all. Word in town is Hawthorne's looking for something specific, something hidden in this valley. Matthew's hands freeze over an old marshal's ledger. The Sutton gang's gold, he says quietly. 3 years ago, just before I bought this farm, they robbed a military payroll train. Over 100,000 in gold coins. They were headed this way when I caught up with them in the Blackwater Canyon. The gold was never found, Doc adds, understanding dawning in his eyes. Because only 2 people knew where it was hidden, Matthew confirms. Me and Jacob Sutton himself. He told me its location just before he died, thinking I'd help him escape. Instead, I brought in his body and let people think the gold was lost in the canyon. Outside, an owl's cry breaks the night silence. Matthew moves to the shed's small window, scanning the darkness with the instincts of a man who spent years being hunted and hunting others. That's why I chose this farm, Doc. The gold's buried here, under the old oak tree near the creek. Been meaning to turn it in, but after the Carson gang incident, he shakes his head. Wanted to leave that life behind completely. Doc rises, his medical bag creaking with the movement. Well, seems that life isn't done with you yet. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Matthew begins cleaning his peacemaker, the familiar routine bringing back memories of countless nights spent preparing for dangerous arrests. First, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Keller and the riders are just the visible part. Hawthorne never shows his full hand at once. Got some help there, Doc responds, pulling a folded paper from his bag. Sarah Thompson, the sheriff's daughter, works at the telegraph office. She's been keeping track of suspicious messages. Seems Hawthorne's got at least 10 more men scattered around the valley, waiting for orders. Matthew nods, his tactical mind already forming plans. We'll need eyes in town, people we can trust. Hawthorne's men will be watching the farm, but they won't expect a simple farmer to have his own network. Already ahead of you, Doc smiles. Rose Miller at the boarding house, John Chen at the livery stable, and young Billy White who runs messages. They're all willing to help. They've seen what happened in Cedar Ridge. Don't want the same thing here. The next hour is spent in detailed planning. Matthew marks potential ambush points on a map, identifying places where Hawthorne's men might strike. His years of experience tracking outlaws gives him insight into their likely tactics. They'll try to pressure me first, he explains. Threaten the livestock, maybe start a fire. When that doesn't work, they'll come in force, probably at night. Doc watches his friend transform before his eyes. The quiet farmer's demeanor falls away, revealing the calculating lawman beneath. You know they'll kill you if they get the chance. Hawthorne doesn't leave witnesses. I know, Matthew responds, checking the load in his revolver. But they're expecting a simple farmer. They don't know they're dealing with the man who brought down the Carson gang. And this time, he adds, his voice hardening, I'm not just protecting a payroll, I'm protecting my home. As Doc prepares to leave, he pauses in the doorway. Your reputation was built on bringing men in alive, Matthew. That's what set you apart from other bounty hunters. Will you be able to maintain that principle when they come for your farm? Matthew's response is interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the direction of the farmhouse, followed by the orange glow of flames. Looks like they're not waiting for the new moon, he says grimly, grabbing his rifle. Time to show them why they used to call me the ghost hunter. The night erupts into chaos as Matthew and Doc rush toward the burning farmhouse, their shoes crunching on broken glass. The peaceful evening has been shattered, marking the beginning of a conflict that will force Matthew Reed to confront not just Hawthorne's men, but his own past as well. Through the smoke and flickering flames, Matthew spots 2 figures retreating on horseback, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. A burning bottle lies shattered on his porch, a crude warning delivered with coal oil and malice. Doc quickly organizes a bucket line from the well, while Matthew circles the house, his Winchester ready, old instincts surfacing like muscle memory. Just the porch, thank the Lord, Doc calls out as they manage to contain the flames. Looks like this was meant as a message rather than real destruction. He pauses, examining a piece of the broken bottle. Coal oil, just like in Cedar Ridge, Hawthorne's signature. Matthew studies the ground around the house, reading signs others would miss. His years tracking outlaws taught him to see stories in the smallest details: broken twigs, displaced gravel, the depth of hoofprints in soft earth. 2 riders, he confirms, but there were more watching from the tree line. At least 3, maybe 4. He points to barely visible tracks in the grass. They're testing our response, seeing how I handle pressure. The sound of approaching horses draws their attention. Sheriff Thompson arrives with 2 deputies, their lanterns swinging in the darkness. The sheriff, a man more accustomed to breaking up drunken brawls than dealing with organized crime, looks uncomfortable as he surveys the scene. "Saw the flames from town," Thompson says, dismounting. "This is the 3rd incident this week. First, the Miller place had their barn door shot full of holes. Then Chen's livery stable got vandalized." He removes his hat, wiping his brow. "Getting hard to pretend these are just random acts." Matthew exchanges a knowing look with Doc. The pieces are falling into place. Hawthorne's men are systematically targeting anyone who might stand against them. "Sheriff," he says carefully, "I respect your badge and your authority in this valley. But these men won't stop at vandalism. I've seen their kind before back in Wyoming." The mention of Wyoming makes Thompson's eyes narrow slightly. Like most folks in Whispering Pine, he knows Matthew Reed only as the quiet farmer who moved in 3 years ago. "You seem to know a lot about men like this, Reed." "A man learns things, traveling through territories," Matthew responds diplomatically. "And I've done my share of traveling." He gestures to the burnt porch. "This isn't random. They're organized, methodical. They'll keep escalating until they get what they want." One of the deputies, young Billy White's older brother James, steps forward. "What exactly do they want? Sure, the railroad's coming, but why target specific farms? There's plenty of land for sale in the valley." Before Matthew can respond, more riders approach. Sarah Thompson, the sheriff's daughter, arrives with Rose Miller from the boarding house. Sarah's face is flushed with both exertion and anger. "Pa, you need to hear this," she says, dismounting gracefully. "Just intercepted a telegraph message at the office. Hawthorne's men aren't just after land. They're searching for something specific." Matthew feels his chest tighten, but keeps his expression neutral. Sarah continues, pulling a copied message from her satchel. "They mentioned a payroll shipment from 3 years ago. The Sutton gang robbery." She looks directly at Matthew. "For some reason, they think there's a connection to this valley." Sheriff Thompson's posture changes subtly. The Sutton gang robbery was big news across 3 territories. The missing gold had sparked countless searches and rumors. "That's federal business," he says firmly. "If Hawthorne's men are looking for that gold, we need to contact the territorial marshal." "Marshals won't get here in time," Rose Miller interjects. Her boarding house sits at the heart of Whispering Pine, making her privy to most town gossip. Hawthorne's men are getting impatient. "Overheard 2 of them at dinner tonight talking about making examples of anyone who won't sell." Matthew walks to his barn, mind racing. The gold hidden under the old oak tree suddenly feels like a burning coal beneath his feet. Its presence puts everyone in danger, but revealing it now would only confirm Hawthorne's suspicions and potentially spark a bloody confrontation. "We need to organize," he says finally, turning to face the group. "Sheriff, your men can't be everywhere at once, but the townspeople can watch out for each other, create a warning system, make it harder for Hawthorne's men to isolate their targets." Something in his tone, the natural authority, the strategic thinking, makes Sheriff Thompson look at him with new eyes. "You've done this before, haven't you, Reed? This isn't your first time dealing with men like Hawthorne." A tense moment passes. Matthew feels the weight of his hidden badge, the pressure of his secret identity. But before he can respond, Doc steps in. What matters is that he's right. We need to organize, and maybe it's time this town had a proper deputy, someone with experience. The suggestion hangs in the air. Sheriff Thompson strokes his mustache thoughtfully. Been thinking about that myself. Town's growing, with the railroad coming. Could use another deputy, someone who knows more than just breaking up saloon fights. Matthew holds up his hand. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I'm just a farmer now. My fighting days are behind me. Sarah Thompson, who has been studying Matthew intently, speaks up. Sometimes we don't get to choose when we fight, Mr. Reed. Only what we're fighting for. Her words strike uncomfortably close to home. Matthew looks at his farmhouse, at the scorched porch that mars its peaceful appearance. He thinks of the gold buried nearby, of the violence it might bring to this community he's grown to care about. Give me the night to think about it, he tells Thompson. But regardless of your offer, I'll help organize the town's defense. These men need to learn that Whispering Pine isn't Cedar Ridge. We stand together here. As the group disperses, Doc lingers behind. You know this is just the beginning, he says quietly. Sooner or later, you'll have to decide which matters more, keeping your past buried or using it to protect these people. A flicker of uncertainty crosses Burke's face. The Blackwater Gang's capture was legendary among outlaws, the work of the mysterious ghost hunter who seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as Matthew watches the others ride back toward town, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Maybe, he responds, there's a way to do both. He turns to his old friend. Doc, I need you to send a message. There's someone who should know what's happening here, someone who might understand what we're really dealing with. Doc raises an eyebrow. You don't mean... Yes, Matthew nods. Send word to Marshal Sarah Carson in Wyoming. Tell her the ghost hunter needs her help one last time. The night wind carries the scent of burnt wood and approaching danger. In his mind, Matthew begins forming a plan. One that might allow him to protect his new home without fully resurrecting the man he used to be. But as he checks his Winchester one last time before heading inside, he knows that some ghosts refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you lay them to rest. The next morning dawns cold and clear over Whispering Pine Valley. Matthew tends to his morning chores with heightened awareness, noting fresh hoofprints along his property line, Hawthorne's men maintaining their watch. The morning dew reveals their patrol patterns to his trained eye, telling a story of regular surveillance that most farmers would miss. Inside his house, the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards now stands empty, its contents distributed strategically around the property. The peacemaker rests in a holster behind the kitchen door, the Winchester rifle lies concealed in a hay wagon, and additional ammunition is cached in the barn's hayloft. Years of hunting dangerous men taught Matthew the value of having weapons within easy reach. "Morning, Mr. Reed," a young voice calls out. Billy White, the messenger boy, rides up on his pony. His usual cheerful demeanor is tempered by obvious concern. "Got word from Doc Wilson. Says Marshal Carson received his telegram and is riding hard from Cheyenne. Should be here in 3 days, weather permitting." Matthew nods, offering the boy a drink of water. Sarah Carson was more than just a fellow marshal. She'd been his partner during the hunt for her father's killers, the infamous Carson gang. She understood better than anyone the cost of wearing a badge and the price of laying it down. "Any other news from town?" Matthew asks, noting how Billy's eyes keep darting toward the tree line where Hawthorne's men lurk. "Yes, sir. Miss Sarah, Sheriff Thompson's daughter, she's been organizing the women in town. They've set up a system of hanging different-colored sheets on washing lines. Each color means something different. Red for danger, white for all clear, blue for strangers in town." The boy's chest puffs with pride at being part of the resistance. Smart girl, Matthew murmurs. The sheet system would allow townspeople to warn each other without being obvious about it. Anything else? Billy's expression darkens. The Ryder brothers were at Rose's boarding house this morning, threatening-like, said anyone who doesn't sell their property by week's end might find themselves in an early grave. He pauses, gathering courage. Mr. Reed, folks in town are saying you're different from other farmers. Say you've got experience with men like this. Before Matthew can respond, the thunder of approaching hooves interrupts them. Jack, Snake Eyes Keller, rides up with 4 new men. Hard cases by the look of them, trail-worn and heavily armed. Matthew recognizes one of them. Marcus Deadshot Burke, a hired gun known for his work with the Blackwater gang. "I hope we're not interrupting your morning social," Keller calls out, his false warmth doing nothing to mask the menace in his voice. "Just thought you might want to reconsider Mr. Hawthorne's generous offer, especially after last night's unfortunate incident." Matthew positions himself between Billy and the riders, his stance casual but ready. "My answer hasn't changed, Keller. This land's not for sale." Deadshot. Burke spits tobacco juice into the dust. "Awful sure of yourself for a simple farmer," he drawls, his hand resting near his holstered revolver. "Maybe you ain't heard what happened to the last folks who got stubborn with Mr. Hawthorne." "I've heard," Matthew responds evenly. "Just like I've heard about what happened to the Blackwater gang up in Wyoming Territory. 7 hard men thought they could take whatever they wanted. Now they're all serving time in territorial prison." He lets his gaze meet Burke's. Except for their leader, of course. He didn't survive the arrest. Quickly, Keller, noticing the exchange, studies Matthew more carefully. "You seem to know a lot about Wyoming Territory, farmer." "Wyoming Territory. Man picks up stories traveling around," Matthew says mildly. "Learns which sorts of men to avoid." His hand hangs near his leg, inches from where his peacemaker would have rested in his martial days. The gesture isn't lost on Burke, whose face has gone pale. "Let's ride," Burke says suddenly, turning his horse. "Ain't nothing here worth dying over." Keller looks like he wants to argue, but something in Matthew's steady gaze makes him reconsider. "Think about your position, Reed," he says finally. "Hate to see anything happen to this nice farm of yours, or to young Billy here." The threat hangs in the air like gunsmoke. After they ride off, Billy releases a shaky breath. "Mr. Reed, the way you stood up to them and what you said about Wyoming—" "Billy," Matthew interrupts gently, "some stories are better left untold. Now ride back to town and tell Doc Wilson what happened here. And Billy," the boy turns in his saddle, "tell him Deadshot Burke was with them. He'll understand what that means." As Billy gallops away, Matthew begins making preparations. Burke's presence changes everything. The man had been present during the Sutton gang robbery, though he'd escaped capture. If he recognizes Matthew, Hawthorne's men might stop playing games and come in force. He spends the morning setting up defensive positions around the farm. Years of manhunting taught him to think like his prey, to anticipate their moves. He rigs tripwires in likely approach routes, positions mirrors to catch sunlight and signal movement, and ensures every building offers both cover and escape routes. Around noon, Doc Wilson arrives with Sarah Thompson. The sheriff's daughter carries her father's spare revolver openly on her hip now, and her eyes show the determination of someone who's chosen their side in the coming fight. "Burke recognized you," Doc states without preamble. "He's in the saloon right now, drinking heavily and telling anyone who'll listen about the ghost hunter of Wyoming." "How long until they figure it out?" Sarah asks, her hand unconsciously touching her revolver. Matthew checks the load in his Winchester. "Won't take long. Burke may be a killer, but he's not stupid. Question is, will they run or come at us harder?" "They won't run," Sarah says firmly. "Not with the gold somewhere in this valley. Hawthorne's put too much into this operation to back down now." Doc nods in agreement. Already seeing changes in town. More of Hawthorne's men arriving hourly. They're positioning themselves around key buildings, the telegraph office, the bank, the livery stable. Getting ready to lock down the town, Matthew confirms. Standard tactic when they're planning something big. He looks at Sarah. Your father needs to be ready. Once they move, it'll happen fast. Pa knows, Sarah responds. He's deputized 10 more men since this morning, but she hesitates. They're not gunfighters, Mr. Reed. They're shopkeepers and farmers. If it comes to real violence, then we'll need every advantage we can get, Matthew finishes. He makes a decision he's been wrestling with since dawn. Doc, that chest in your clinic, the one I asked you to keep safe, it's time to open it. Doc's eyes widen. You sure about this? Once that box is opened, there's no going back to being just a farmer. I stopped being just a farmer the moment Hawthorne's men rode into this valley, Matthew replies. Time to show them why they used to fear the ghost hunter's name. The chest from Doc's clinic lies open on Matthew's kitchen table, its contents telling the story of a life he'd tried to leave behind. A silver marshal's badge catches the afternoon light, alongside newspaper clippings chronicling the exploits of the ghost hunter. Various wanted posters bear the names and faces of men he'd brought to justice, including several members of Hawthorne's current gang. Never did understand why they called you the ghost hunter, Sarah Thompson says, examining a worn poster of the Sutton gang. The evening sun streams through the farmhouse windows as she, Doc, and Matthew pore over the materials. Because no one ever saw him coming, Doc answers, a hint of pride in his voice. He'd study his prey for weeks, learning their habits, their weaknesses. By the time they knew they were being hunted, it was too late. Matthew runs his fingers over the badge's smooth surface. The name wasn't about hunting ghosts, it was about becoming one. Moving unseen, striking where they least expected. He looks up at Sarah. Your colored sheet system in town? That's exactly the kind of thinking we need now. Their planning session is interrupted by the arrival of Rose Miller, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled from a hard ride. They're moving, she announces without preamble. Burke's been talking to everyone who'll listen about the ghost hunter. Keller sent riders to every farm in the valley, demanding they sell by sunset tomorrow. They're forcing our hand, Matthew observes, spreading out a map of the valley. How many men does Hawthorne have now? At least 20 that I've counted, Rose replies. They're taking rooms all over town, but mostly at Jenkins' place. He sold out to Hawthorne last week. She points to various locations on the map. They've got men watching every road, every trail. Town's practically under siege. Sarah's face hardens with determination. The women's signaling system is still working. We've been passing messages right under their noses. Most of the townspeople are ready to stand with us. They're just waiting for the right moment. Matthew studies the map, his tactical mind assessing possibilities. Hawthorne's men expect resistance from the sheriff, maybe a few angry farmers. They don't know about the organization you've built. That's our advantage. He traces key positions with his finger. We need to get word to every loyal family in the valley. When they come for this farm, and they will, we need to be ready. Marshal Carson's still 2 days out, Doc reminds them. Can we hold them that long? We don't have a choice, Matthew responds. But first, we need to eliminate their advantages. Sarah, can you get access to the telegraph office tonight? She nods confidently. Lucy, the night operator, is with us. Why? Send false messages. Make them think the territorial marshal is a day away, not 3. Create confusion about their own reinforcements. He turns to Rose. Your boarding house sees a lot of traffic. Start rumors about ghost hunter sightings in different parts of the valley. Let's make them jumpy, paranoid. Psychological warfare, Doc muses. Just like you used on the Carson gang. Matthew continues outlining his strategy. We need to split their forces, make them defend too many positions. Once they're spread thin, he's interrupted by the sound of gunfire from town, followed by shouting. They rush to the window. In the distance, smoke rises from the direction of the livery stable. It's starting, Rose whispers. They're moving faster than we expected. No, Matthew corrects her, buckling on his gun belt. They're desperate. Burke recognized me, and now they're scared. Scared men make mistakes. He checks his peacemaker with practiced ease. Doc, get word to Sheriff Thompson. Tell him to hold the jail and the bank. Don't try to defend everything. Sarah, start your signal system. Let everyone know it's time. And you? Sarah asks, though she already knows the answer. The ghost hunter worked best from the shadows, Matthew replies, his voice taking on the hard edge they'd only heard hints of before. Time to show Hawthorne's men why. He retrieves a dark duster from the chest, the same one he'd worn during his martial days. They want to find the Sutton gang's gold? Let's make them work for it. As his friends ride back to town, Matthew begins his own preparations. He moves through the growing darkness with practiced stealth, positioning himself where Hawthorne's watchmen won't expect. The skills that made him legendary in Wyoming return with fluid ease. The ability to move unseen, to predict his opponent's movements, to strike fear into hardened outlaws. The night deepens over Whispering Pine Valley, bringing with it the promise of violence. But for the first time since Hawthorne's men arrived, Matthew feels truly himself. The quiet farmer recedes, replaced by the lawman who'd brought justice to the territories. Tomorrow would test not just his guns, but his ability to protect his new home without losing the peace he'd found here. In town, colored sheets begin appearing on washing lines, signals passing between determined citizens preparing to defend their home. The ghost hunter's legend was about to grow, and Whispering Pine would never be the same. Darkness settles over Whispering Pine Valley like a velvet shroud, broken only by scattered lantern light from the town and the occasional gleam of stars through gathering clouds. Matthew moves like a shadow through his property, years of experience guiding his steps. From his vantage point near the old oak tree, where the Sutton gang's gold still lies buried, he can see the movements of Hawthorne's watchers. They're getting sloppy, their fear showing in their frequent glances over shoulders and jumpy reactions to every night sound. Burke's revelation about the ghost hunter has done its work, spreading unease through their ranks like poison. Through his spyglass, Matthew counts 4 men positioned around his farm, their horses tethered nearby for quick escape if needed. The distant sound of breaking glass carries from town, followed by shouts and more gunfire. Hawthorne's men are making their move, trying to assert control before their quarry can slip away. But Matthew knows something they don't. The town is ready for them. A flash of white from a distant clothesline catches his attention. Sarah Thompson's signal that the sheriff's men are in position. Red sheets appear on 3 different houses, warning of danger near the bank. The women's signaling system is working perfectly, allowing the townspeople to coordinate without speaking a word. Getting quite a show, aren't they? Doc Wilson's whispered voice comes from behind Matthew, showing that the old physician hasn't forgotten his own tracking skills from the war. Hawthorne's men are searching every building in town, making quite a mess of things. Matthew nods, not surprised by his friend's stealthy approach. How many? 23 that I counted, split into groups, some watching the roads, others searching buildings. Keller's got 6 men at Jenkins' place, planning something big for tomorrow. Doc settles beside him in the darkness. Burke's been drinking heavy at the saloon, telling stories about the ghost hunter that have half their men looking over their shoulders. A grim smile crosses Matthew's face. Good. Fear makes men careless, and careless men make mistakes. He checks his peacemaker, the familiar weight comforting in his hand. Any word from Marshal Carson? Telegraph came through just before they took the office. She's riding hard, should be here by tomorrow night. Doc pauses, watching another red sheet appear in town. Think we can hold that long? We don't have a choice. Matthew's voice carries the steel that made him legendary in Wyoming. But first, we need to thin their numbers, make them understand what they're really dealing with. As if on cue, a horse's frightened whinny breaks the night's silence. One of Hawthorne's watchers has ridden too close to Matthew's carefully laid trap. A series of ropes strung between trees at horse height, nearly invisible in the darkness. The rider goes down hard, his cursing carrying clearly through the night air. "That's our cue," Matthew says, moving like a ghost through the underbrush. Doc follows, his own movements surprisingly quiet for a man his age. They approach the fallen rider from different directions, using the darkness as cover. The man is still struggling with his tangled horse when Matthew's voice comes from the shadows, carrying the same deadly calm that made outlaws tremble in Wyoming. "Evening, Mr. Burke. Been a while since Blackwater Canyon." Burke freezes, his face pale in the starlight. "Ghost hunter," he whispers, fear replacing the alcohol-induced bravado from earlier. His hand moves toward his gun, but Matthew's voice stops him. "I wouldn't. You were slow on the draw in Wyoming, and you're 3 years older now." A shadow moves in the darkness, and Burke feels the cold press of a rifle barrel against his neck. Doc's contribution to the scene. "We're going to have a quiet conversation about Hawthorne's plans. Then you're going to deliver a message for me." 20 minutes later, Burke rides hard for town, his previous bravado replaced by genuine terror. Behind him, Matthew and Doc watch him go, knowing his tale of encountering the ghost hunter will spread through Hawthorne's men like wildfire. "Think he'll tell them everything?" Doc asks, shouldering his rifle. "Everything and more," Matthew confirms. "By morning, they'll be jumping at shadows, seeing the ghost hunter in every dark corner. That's when we'll really get to work." They make their way back toward the farmhouse, but Matthew stops at the old oak tree. His hand rests on its rough bark, feeling the age-old strength beneath. Somewhere beneath its roots lies the gold that started all this. The Sutton gang's last score, hidden away as a final act of defiance. "You know," Doc says thoughtfully, "this whole thing might be easier if we just dug up that gold, turned it into the territorial authorities." Matthew shakes his head. "It's not about the gold anymore. Hawthorne and his men need to learn that some places can't be bought or bullied. Some people won't be broken." His voice takes on a determined edge. "What happens here will send a message across the territory." Their conversation is interrupted by a pattern of whistles from the direction of town. Sarah Thompson's signal that more of Hawthorne's men are on the move. Through his spyglass, Matthew can see torches being lit, horses being saddled. "They're coming," he says quietly. "Keller's not waiting for morning. Get back to town, Doc. Make sure everyone's ready. It's time to show them why they called me the ghost hunter." As Doc disappears into the darkness, Matthew begins his final preparations. The quiet farmer vanishes completely, replaced by the lawman who'd become legend in the Wyoming Territory. Every trap is checked, every escape route confirmed. His mother's old saying comes back to him: "A smart hunter doesn't just track his prey, he makes the land itself become his ally." The night wraps around him like an old friend as he moves through the shadows, becoming one with the darkness. In town, more signals appear on washing lines. The people of Whispering Pine preparing for what's to come. They've chosen their ground, and soon Hawthorne's men will learn what it means to face not just one legendary lawman, but an entire town united against them. The first hints of dawn paint the eastern sky as Hawthorne's men make their move. Through the pre-morning mist, Matthew counts 15 riders approaching his farm from different directions, their torches cutting through the darkness like angry fireflies. Jack, Snake Eyes Keller leads them, his silver spurs catching the torchlight as they draw near. From his position in the barn's hayloft, Matthew watches them approach through his spyglass. Burke isn't among them, likely too shaken by his encounter with the ghost hunter to join this assault. But the Ryder brothers are there, along with some of the territory's most notorious gunmen. Hawthorne isn't taking any chances. "Reed!" Keller's voice carries across the quiet farm. "We know who you are now, ghost hunter. Come on out, and maybe we can make a deal." His false bravado does little to mask the tension in his voice. Behind him, his men spread out, trying to cover all approaches to the farmhouse. Matthew's response comes not in words, but in action. A carefully placed mirror catches the torchlight, momentarily blinding two of Keller's men. In that instant of confusion, a rope snaps tight across their path, sending horses and riders tumbling. The night erupts in chaos as more of Matthew's traps spring into action. Loose boards giving way, hidden nooses catching the unwary, frightened horses throwing their riders. "He's playing with us!" Tom Ryder shouts, firing blindly into the darkness. His shots go wide, but the sound sets off a chain reaction of panicked gunfire from Hawthorne's men. They shoot at shadows, at rustling leaves, at anything that moves. Matthew's voice seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, a ghost in the darkness. "Last chance, Keller. Take your men and ride out. This valley isn't for sale." "Show yourself, coward!" Frank Ryder screams, his young face twisted with fear and rage. "Face us like a man!" A single shot rings out, and Frank's gun goes flying from his hand. The bullet had struck with surgical precision, disarming without killing, the ghost hunter's trademark. Before anyone can react, two more shots follow, disarming Tom Ryder and another of Hawthorne's men just as cleanly. Panic begins to spread through their ranks. These men are used to bullying farmers and townspeople, not facing an unseen enemy who strikes with terrifying accuracy. Some begin to retreat, only to find their escape routes blocked by more tripwires and obstacles. In town, colored sheets begin appearing on washing lines, blue for strangers approaching, red for danger. Sarah Thompson's signal system spreads the word. The territorial marshal's posse has been spotted, still hours away, but coming fast. More importantly, Sheriff Thompson and his deputies are moving into position, ready to prevent any of Hawthorne's men from falling back to town. Matthew moves through the shadows like the ghost they named him for, each shot carefully placed to disarm rather than kill. Years of experience guide his movements as he uses the pre-dawn darkness to his advantage. The land itself seems to fight alongside him, every tree providing cover, every shadow offering concealment. "Enough of this!" Keller's voice cracks with frustration. He pulls something from his saddlebag, a bottle with a rag stuffed in its neck. "Let's see how the ghost hunter deals with fire." He lights the makeshift bomb, drawing back his arm to throw. A shot rings out, shattering the bottle in Keller's hand. The flames catch his sleeve instead, sending him tumbling from his horse in panic. "That was a warning," Matthew's voice carries from the darkness. "The next one won't be." Suddenly, new voices join the chaos. "Marshal's office, drop your weapons!" Sarah Thompson leads a group of deputies from one direction, while Doc Wilson and armed townspeople emerge from another. Hawthorne's men find themselves caught in a crossfire, their advantage of numbers meaningless against their unseen opponent and the aroused citizenry. Some try to fight back, but their nerve is broken. Years of bullying helpless farmers hasn't prepared them for organized resistance. One by one, they throw down their weapons, hands raised in surrender. Matthew finally steps into view, his dark duster and silver badge catching the first real light of dawn. He moves with the fluid grace of a predator, the peacemaker in his hand steady as a rock. "It's over, Keller. Whispering Pine isn't Cedar Ridge. These people aren't afraid of you anymore." Keller, his burned arm cradled against his chest, looks around wildly. His men are disarmed and surrounded, the townspeople holding them at gunpoint with a determination born of righteous anger. "You don't understand," he stammers. "Hawthorne will come. He'll burn this whole valley to the ground." "Let him come," Sarah Thompson declares, her father's deputy badge gleaming on her chest. "He'll find more than just the ghost hunter waiting for him." As the sun rises fully over Whispering Pine Valley, Sheriff Thompson and his men begin taking the prisoners into custody. The colored sheets that served as signals now wave like victory banners in the morning breeze. But Matthew knows this isn't over. Hawthorne himself is still out there, and he won't take this defeat lightly. Doc Wilson approaches, his rifle still ready. Marshal Carson and her posse are just hours away, he reports. But something else you should know. Got word that Hawthorne himself was seen leaving Cedar Ridge last night, riding this way with more men. Matthew nods, checking the load in his peacemaker. The real battle for Whispering Pine is still to come. But as he looks at the determined faces of the townspeople, he knows they'll face it together. The ghost hunter isn't just one man anymore. He's become a symbol of resistance, of a community's refusal to be victimized. Get everyone ready, he tells Doc. Hawthorne won't come at us the same way Keller did. He's smarter, more ruthless. This was just the beginning. The morning sun reveals the night's work. Scattered weapons, thrown riders, sprung traps, but it also shows something more important. A town united, standing strong against those who would take what isn't theirs. The legend of the ghost hunter has been reborn, not as a lone avenger, but as the spirit of justice itself. The mid-morning sun beats down on Whispering Pine as Matthew and Sheriff Thompson oversee the imprisonment of Keller and his men. The town jail, built to hold drunks and rowdy cowboys, now strains to contain 15 of the territory's most dangerous outlaws. The Ryder brothers share a cell, their earlier bravado replaced by sullen silence. 6 more hours until Marshal Carson arrives, Thompson says, checking his pocket watch. His voice carries both relief and concern. Question is, will Hawthorne get here first? Matthew studies a map spread across the sheriff's desk, marking known approaches to the valley. His years of tracking outlaws taught him to think like his prey, to anticipate their moves. Hawthorne's not like Keller, he explains. He won't rush in half-cocked. He'll study the situation, look for weaknesses. Sarah Thompson enters the office, her face flushed from a hard ride. Just got word from our lookouts. Hawthorne was spotted crossing Thunder Ridge with at least 30 riders. They're moving slow, careful-like. She points to several locations on the map. And we've got another problem. Some of his men are already in position here, and here, blocking the main roads into town. Cutting us off from outside help, Matthew nods. Classic siege tactics. He's isolating us before making his move. He traces potential routes with his finger. But he doesn't know these hills like we do. There are old mining trails, cattle paths. Doc Wilson joins them, bringing news from his own sources. Rose's boarding house is full of frightened townspeople. Word of Hawthorne's approach is spreading fast. Some folks are talking about selling out while they can. They need to understand what that means, Sarah interjects firmly. Cedar Ridge isn't just a cautionary tale. It's our future if we don't stand together. Hawthorne doesn't just buy land, he buys souls. Matthew's mind races through possibilities. The morning's victory over Keller's men had boosted morale, but Hawthorne's approaching force presents a different kind of threat. They need something more than just guns and courage. They need a plan that will break not just Hawthorne's men, but his power over the territory. The gold, he says suddenly, an idea forming. Hawthorne's built his reputation on always getting what he wants. His men follow him because they think he's invincible. What if we use the Sutton gang's gold to bait a trap? That's mighty risky, Thompson warns. If anything goes wrong, everything's risky now, Matthew counters. But Hawthorne's pride is his weakness. He wants that gold almost as much as he wants the land, not just for its value, but for what it represents. Finding something the ghost hunter couldn't, Sarah catches on quickly. We could spread word through town, let it leak to his spies, make him think we're moving the gold tonight, trying to slip it past his blockade. Meanwhile, Doc adds, understanding the plan, we use the confusion to get messages through to Marshal Carson, let her know exactly where to hit Hawthorne's line. Matthew nods approvingly. But first, we need to show the townspeople they can stand up to him. Fear's his real weapon. Break that, and his power starts to crumble. They spend the next hour organizing their defenses. The colored sheet signal system expands, with new combinations warning of specific threats. Townspeople volunteer as lookouts, messengers, and fighters. The women of Whispering Pine turn their quilting circle into an ammunition-loading party, while the children run messages between defensive positions. Around noon, a rider approaches under a white flag. Matthew recognizes him as James Howard, once a respected judge, before Hawthorne bought his loyalty. "Mr. Reed," Howard calls out, his judicial dignity somewhat diminished by the fear in his eyes. Mr. Hawthorne sends his compliments and an offer of parley. "Awful generous of him," Matthew responds dryly, "considering his last negotiator tried to burn down my farm." Howard shifts uncomfortably in his saddle. Mr. Hawthorne regrets the overzealous actions of Mr. Keller and his associates. He proposes a meeting, just the two of you, to discuss a peaceful resolution. Where and when? Sunset at the old mission church outside town. You come alone, he comes alone. Howard pauses, then adds, "He says to tell you he knows about Bitter Creek, what really happened there. Says that's worth discussing too." Matthew's face remains impassive, but internally his mind races. Bitter Creek had been his last case as the ghost hunter, the one that made him hang up his badge. Only a handful of people knew the true story of what happened there. "Tell Mr. Hawthorne I'll be there," he says finally. "And Howard, remember when you used to serve justice instead of just the highest bidder? Might be time to think about which side of history you want to be on." As the former judge rides away, Doc approaches. "You're not really going to meet him alone." "Of course not," Matthew replies, "but Hawthorne isn't either. This is our chance to figure out his real plan." He turns to Sarah. "Get word to your lookouts. I want to know every man Hawthorne positions within 5 miles of that church." The afternoon passes in tense preparation. Through his network of observers, Matthew learns that Hawthorne's men have already surrounded the town, cutting off all obvious escape routes. But the people of Whispering Pine, instead of cowering, respond with quiet determination. Every house becomes a potential stronghold, every citizen a defender. As the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, Matthew straps on his gun belt one last time. The peacemaker's weight is familiar, comforting. In his pocket, he carries his old marshal's badge, not to wear, but as a reminder of the oath he once took to protect the innocent. "Whatever Hawthorne says about Bitter Creek," Doc tells him quietly, "remember why you gave up the badge. Some prices are too high, even for justice." Matthew nods, checking his weapons one final time. "Keep everyone ready. If this goes bad..." He leaves the sentence unfinished. "It won't," Sarah asserts firmly. "The ghost hunter's not alone anymore." As Matthew rides toward the old mission church, the setting sun paints the valley in shades of gold and shadow. Behind him, Whispering Pine prepares for whatever the night might bring. The legend of the ghost hunter had been born in loneliness and pursuit of justice, but its rebirth would be different, forged in community, strengthened by shared purpose. The real question was, would that be enough to stop a man like Hawthorne? The old mission church stands silhouetted against the sunset, its weathered cross reaching toward the darkening sky. Matthew approaches carefully, reading the signs around him like a book, fresh hoofprints in the dusty ground, broken twigs that mark hidden observers, the subtle movement of shadows where Hawthorne's men wait in ambush. James' iron rail. Hawthorne stands alone on the church steps, his black coat and silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight. He's shorter than Matthew expected, but carries himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to being feared. A gold watch chain glints across his vest, a symbol of the wealth he's built on others' misery. "The famous ghost hunter," Hawthorne calls out, his cultured voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Though I hear you prefer farmer these days. Quite a fall from grace, wouldn't you say?" Matthew dismounts slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. His trained eye counts at least 10 hidden gunmen among the rocks and trees. Depends on how you measure success, Hawthorne. I sleep pretty well at night. Ah yes, the peace of honest labor. Hawthorne's smile doesn't reach his eyes. Tell me, did that peace help you forget Bitter Creek? The women and children in that burning cabin? The choices you had to make? The words hit their mark, but Matthew's face remains impassive. You seem to know a lot about that day. I make it my business to know about potential threats, Hawthorne responds, descending the steps. Just like I know about the Sutton gang's gold buried under that old oak tree on your farm. Did you really think you could keep that secret forever? Like you kept secret what really happened in Cedar Ridge, Matthew counters. How many families died in those accidental fires? A shadow crosses Hawthorne's face. Progress requires sacrifice, Marshall. Or should I say, Mr. Reed? The railroad's coming, bringing civilization with it. The future belongs to men who aren't afraid to take what they want. The future belongs to the people who work the land, raise their families, build something real. Matthew's voice carries the weight of conviction. Not to men who steal dreams and call it progress. Hawthorne's facade of civility cracks slightly. Speaking of dreams, I had an interesting conversation with someone who survived Bitter Creek. She had quite a story to tell about the great ghost hunter's moment of weakness. Matthew's hand tightens imperceptibly on his gun belt. Only 3 people had survived that day, and one of them was supposed to be dead. Sarah Mitchell, Hawthorne continues, watching Matthew's reaction. The woman you let escape, even though you knew she was part of the gang. Your one great failure as a lawman. I made a choice, Matthew responds quietly, between justice and mercy. Between the letter of the law and what was right. And it cost you everything, Hawthorne presses. Your reputation, your badge, your purpose. Now here you are, playing farmer and trying to stop progress, but I'm offering you a chance to redeem yourself. By selling out? Becoming another Judge Howard, trading justice for gold? By being practical. Hawthorne spreads his hands. The railroad's coming whether these people like it or not. The smart ones will sell now, profit from the inevitable. The others... He shrugs. Well, accidents happen. Matthew studies the man before him, seeing past the expensive clothes and practice charm to the predator beneath. You're right about one thing, he says finally. I did make a choice at Bitter Creek. I chose to remember that a badge isn't just about hunting down criminals, it's about protecting people. And how many will die for that noble principle? Hawthorne's voice hardens. I have 30 men surrounding this town, more arriving daily. How long before someone makes a mistake? Before another cabin catches fire with women and children inside? That's where you're wrong, Matthew responds. You don't have 30 men anymore. While we've been talking, Marshal Carson and her posse have been dealing with your blockade. Those colored sheets on the washing lines? They weren't just for show. For the first time, uncertainty flickers across Hawthorne's face. As if on cue, gunfire erupts in the distance, Marshal Carson's signature Winchester rifle announcing her arrival. And those accidents you're so fond of? Matthew continues. Hard to arrange when every citizen in town is watching, ready to stand together. Your kind only has power when people are afraid and alone. Hawthorne's hand moves toward his coat, but Matthew's voice stops him. I wouldn't. You're good with numbers, contracts, and threats, but I'm betting you haven't drawn a gun in anger since before I was hunting bounties. I don't need to, Hawthorne snarls. I have men for that. He raises his arm, signaling his hidden gunman, but the answering fire doesn't come. Instead, Doc Wilson's voice rings out from the gathering darkness. Looking for these men? One by one, Hawthorne's ambushers are led out at gunpoint by townspeople. Shopkeepers, farmers and women who've decided to stop living in fear. You see, Matthew explains, while you were focusing on me, the ghost hunter, you forgot about the real strength of this valley, its people. They're not afraid anymore, Hawthorne, and without fear, You're just a man who's forgotten the difference between progress and greed. The distant gunfire grows closer. Marshal Carson's voice carries across the valley, ordering Hawthorne's remaining men to surrender. The carefully constructed siege is collapsing, broken by the combined efforts of lawmen and citizens working together. "It's over," Matthew says quietly. "You can surrender now, face justice for Cedar Ridge and all the others, or—" He leaves the alternative unspoken. For a moment, something like respect flickers in Hawthorne's eyes. Then his hand darts into his coat, emerging with a derringer. But Matthew's draw is lightning fast, the peacemaker clearing leather before Hawthorne's weapon is halfway up. The would-be empire builder freezes, looking down the steady barrel of justice. "Like I said," Matthew remarks calmly, "you're out of practice." The sun rises over a transformed, whispering pine valley. 2 days have passed since Hawthorne's arrest, and the town buzzes with activity as people rebuild and strengthen their community. The jail holds not just Hawthorne and Keller, but 28 of their men, all awaiting transport to the territorial prison. Matthew stands on his porch, watching the morning light paint the wheat fields gold. His marshal's badge rests in his hand, its silver surface catching the sunlight. Marshal Sarah Carson approaches, her own badge gleaming. "Territorial courts ready to hear testimonies about Cedar Ridge," she announces, joining him on the porch. Between the townspeople's accounts and Judge Howard's confession, Hawthorne's looking at a long stay behind bars. He won't be building any more empires in this territory. "And Sarah Mitchell?" Matthew asks quietly. "The woman from Bitter Creek?" "Found her in Cedar Ridge," Carson confirms. "She's willing to testify about everything, how Hawthorne used the railroad plans to target vulnerable communities, how he organized the arsons to look like accidents. Even admitted her own part in it, hoping for mercy." Matthew nods, remembering that day at Bitter Creek when he'd chosen to let a young mother escape rather than complete his arrest record. Sometimes justice needs a gentle hand. The sound of approaching horses draws their attention. Sheriff Thompson rides up with his daughter Sarah and Doc Wilson. The town's newly appointed deputy, Sarah wears her badge with pride, having earned it defending her community. "Town council just finished meeting," Sheriff Thompson announces. "They've voted to use the recovered Sutton Gang gold to establish a legal fund, helping other communities stand up to land grabbers and railroad barons." He grins. "Seems the ghost hunter's legacy is spreading." "Not the ghost hunter's legacy," Matthew corrects him. "This belongs to everyone who stood together, who refused to be bullied or bought." He looks at his farmhouse, at the fields he'd worked for 3 years. A badge is just metal. Real justice lives in people's hearts. "Speaking of badges," Marshal Carson interjects, "the territorial governor's offering you your old position back. Says we could use the ghost hunter's skills, especially with the railroad bringing more changes." Matthew considers the badge in his hand, feeling its familiar weight. Then he looks at the faces around him. Doc Wilson, who'd helped him build a new life. Sarah Thompson, who'd organized the town's resistance. The sheriff, who'd learned to trust his people's strength. "Think I'll stick to farming," he says finally, pocketing the badge. "But maybe we can find a middle ground. The ghost hunter worked alone, but this valley showed me there's strength in standing together." "A training program," Sarah suggests eagerly. "Teaching other towns how to organize, protect themselves, not just with guns, but with community." The ghost hunter becomes the ghost teacher. Doc chuckles. Has a certain poetry to it. As they discuss plans for the future, more riders approach. Townspeople coming to help with the harvest. The colored sheets that served as signals now fly as banners of pride, marking a community that discovered its own strength. "You know," Marshal Carson observes, "legends usually fade with time, but what happened here, a town standing together against corruption, that's a story that'll grow stronger with each telling." Matthew watches the townspeople working his fields, sharing the labor as they'd shared the danger. The quiet farmer and the legendary lawman had finally found their balance, not in the shadow of a badge, but in the light of community. "Every valley needs its ghosts," he says quietly, to remind folks that justice isn't just about laws or badges, it's about people choosing to stand together to fight for what's right. The morning sun climbs higher, promising another day of honest work and shared purpose. In the distance, the railroad construction continues, progress coming not as a threat, but as an opportunity for a united community. The ghost hunter's legend had evolved, teaching a lesson more powerful than any single lawman could achieve. True justice grows strongest in the soil of community, watered by courage and tended by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the frontier, where ordinary people discover extraordinary courage. Your support means the world to us, and we've got some amazing stories coming up that you won't want to miss.